When we read the text from Genesis 17 that we did today, it's hard to imagine this is the third repetition of the covenant to Abraham. As easy as it is to forget the promises that have come before it, it's also very easy that in each of the first three encounters that Abraham and Sarai lost something, or more rightly, were asked to sacrifice. It's easier, of course, to focus on what was to be gained. But recall that in the first encounter, Abraham lost his home. I want you to leave your home and go to where I've told you. And he lost his security along the way. You might remember that when they went to Egypt, because there was a great famine, that he had his wife pretend to be his sister so that she wouldn't be stolen away from him. And then finally in the third, he lost his name. He went from Abram to Abraham. He was an old man at this point. He had had that name for more of what we would consider a lifetime. But of course, perspective matters. In the first case, Abraham was given a new land in Canaan, but he had to give up the past one. In the second case, Abraham wasn't killed. And finally, he was honored to become Abraham, the one who was called to take both a new identity and, quite in fact, be the beginnings of new life for the people of many nations. It's right to recognize both the call and all the things that came with that call. But it's also right to recognize the great sacrifice that had come along the way. One without the other risks a misrepresentation of the call entirely. There are promises to be claimed, certainly. But there's also a necessary rending in order to claim those promises. Something that should be increasingly clear during this Lenten sermon series. Abraham was called to leave the familiar, to venture out without any kind of a clear direction when he began, and to accept a promise that seemed increasingly unlikely, only with his trust, only with his faith. He was called on to believe that there was a new home waiting for him. He was called to believe this despite being surrounded by his enemies. And finally, he was called on to take on an entirely new identity and to live into that new identity with all of his life, with his whole life. Wow. How often is it that we really recognize the scope of what was being asked of him? You know, maybe part of why we don't do so as often as maybe we should is because the whole idea of rending our hearts, you know, where we give up something for Lent, maybe it's because that's become such a benign occurrence. We give up chocolate, or we give up soda or caffeine or something that doesn't cost much, something that doesn't really ask that much of us. Yes, all of those things can be good for us, but they don't ask much. They don't require much. Not much trust, not much sacrifice. All in all, pretty easy to do. Nothing so much as what was experienced by Abram. If you haven't read the entire story of Abraham and God's covenant with him recently, I'd challenge you to read back several chapters in Genesis until you find the first of these covenants and conversations with God, and read the whole thing. It goes on for quite a few chapters. Browse your way back to the beginning and read all of it until chapter 17, where we are today. Get a feel for how long all of this has been going on in Abraham's life. Take time to read the margin notes if you have a study Bible. Read all of the things about this. Get some perspective on all of this and how long it was from the beginning to where we are now in our text. Yes, it was assigned to Abram and Abraham, Sarai, Sarah, and to all of us. But if you read carefully, you'll find out it's so much more than that. I'm going to let you in on some of what you'll find when you read over the text that leads to where we are. In Abraham's first encounter with God, he's 75 years old. But in today's text, he's all but 100. And things aren't done. God's not done with him yet. 24 years have passed since that first conversation with God, where he says, leave your home and go and find another that I have for you. You know, that's more than the journey that we've gone on from birth to adulthood in this modern world. Except for one thing. Abraham started it at 75 years old and kept on going. With his old but beautiful wife, with the wife he was worrying having stolen from him in Egypt. He's 99 years old and he still has no son, no heir. Not even by the maidservant. Ishmael hasn't been born yet. There's no Isaac, even in their dreams, it would seem. Certainly he hasn't seen the multitudes as numerous as the stars in the heavens or the grains of sand in the desert. It's just he and his wife still, 24 years later. Yet Abraham still believed. He still had faith. And according to our text in Romans, verses 21 through 22, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And therefore his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. And in the face of all of this, God still comes to him and asks for yet another investment. God asks for a rending of flesh as a sign that Abraham is still on board, still with him, 24 years into it. Is he still all in? You know, for us, it's the very same. Many of us have been believers for as long as we can remember. And many, for certainly, even if they weren't big believers at or near birth, have believed for decades. But no matter how many years we've lived as Christians, as disciples of Jesus Christ, it is still all about belief and faith. that God will do what God says he will do. Verse 23, it will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord. This was never, ever, not in Abraham's time, not in ours. It was never about a short haul. God's looking for people who will be all in, fully convinced, not waiting, but following. And yes, Abraham had moments when he wasn't sure. Sarah had her own. Think about her telling Abraham to go lay with Hagar and all the fallout that came from that. Fallout that's still present today. You can't blame him or her. Really? It was a very long time to hold out hope. Hope in just a promise. A very long time to see a future that seemed to be far from what was possible in reality. Far from what they were still living. People just didn't have children at that age. Anybody looking on to their lives, anybody who had heard his story would think it laughable. How long was it between these conversations with God? Maybe God just forgot about me. Maybe I just pissed him off and he doesn't want anything to do with me anymore. 24 years. And after months, maybe years from the last time he had heard from God, here it comes. That covenant thing again. But with yet one more condition. Walk before me and be blameless. Was that one condition or was it two? And what does blameless even mean? You know, it's only the second time that the word has been used in the Bible up to this point. The first time was when we were introduced to Noah, and all that water came. Pretty big shoes to fill for Abraham there. For Noah, it was shoes big enough to save all of humanity. No pressure, right? Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. Because of the ark, survived even the chaos that water brought with it. Abraham, knowing this story, had to feel like, wow, that's quite a challenge. To live like Noah, to be blameless. But here there's something different. When you read it, you find that Noah walked with God. Something difficult to do, certainly, in any time, in any age. But listen to what God asked for Abraham. Listen to what God asked of Abraham. To walk before God. Maybe even to figure out how himself, how to lead, how to be a sign, as we talked about this past week. How was it that he should follow the path of faith as the first in in line of many that would follow. When we ask about this, we can point to Abraham or to Isaac or to Jacob or to Moses, to Jesus, and on and on and on. We have so many examples of what it means to walk before God. But Abraham had none. Yet nothing precluded him from walking before God, even though he didn't have an example, because his faith had made him righteous. That's not to say he didn't fail, that he didn't fall. He didn't have difficulties from time to time. When he did, he simply had to pick himself up, make adjustments, and continue. He made wrong choices along the way. There's no surprise in that. There's no surprise in it when we make wrong choices. Even in the light of knowing so much more than he did. We sin. We fall. We get up again. Much like the archer whose term sin was taken from. They miss the mark. They turn and they shoot again in hopes of not sinning again. We continue to ask for God's guidance and God's grace. But as we ask, consider a significant difference between the modern world and Abraham's world. In our modern world, it's a one of instant gratification. Just between here and Vancouver on the way home, without any major deviations in my course, I can probably stop at 20 or 25 restaurants that will give me food in an instant, even in the midst of pandemic. Gigabit Ethernet speed. The answer to almost any question that we could conceive of asking, we can get in nanoseconds. You might say, well, what's a nanosecond? That sounds pretty big. Well, I had to look it up because I couldn't remember. It's 1 × 10 to the -9. So that's your decimal place, followed by 9 zeros and a 1. Seconds. Pretty darn fast. But the point is, maybe that instant gratification culture that we live in causes us to be a little bit more impatient than Abraham was. Maybe we expect more and we expect it sooner. And maybe in our culture we struggle with wanting to abandon our bath when we don't change what happens immediately. A 24-hour-year journey toward a promise seems much more than we're willing to risk. Let's take a different track for a few minutes. God had a conversation with Abraham, and then God asked Abraham to walk before him. But in our gospel text, though, Jesus explained to his disciples, who had been with him for years at that point, what was going to come next. He was to suffer and die. And look what Peter has to say about that. Peter, the guy who had been a fisherman just 3 years before, he rebuked Jesus for what he was saying. And look what Jesus says to Peter. Get behind me, Satan. Abraham had believed at what God had said to him. Walk before me. Peter believed, but when he reacted to what he heard, he really overstepped. And he was told to follow, to get behind Jesus. Maybe to listen and learn a little more. Do we really think that Jesus literally meant that Peter was being Satan and taking on those attributes of the fallen? I'd say maybe not in the sense that we imagine it when we read it, but certainly in that moment. Because he wasn't allowing Jesus to be Lord of his life. He was wanting things to go his way instead of God's way. He was impatient. So Jesus had to say to Peter, get behind me, rather than God saying to Abraham, go before me. And that's true because you can't be a sign for God without abiding faith. You can't hear that the road ahead's going to get a little bumpy and say, well, I just can't allow that way. I can't tolerate that. Jesus was looking more for that kind of faith that's willing to wait 24 years and more without faltering. The kind that doesn't demand its own way, as did Peter. Paul gets back to that whole thing when talking about the definition of love in the letter to the Corinthians. And no, we're not talking about perfection. We're not talking about getting every single thing right, because none of us do. It wasn't the case for Abraham. It wasn't the case for Isaac, for Jacob, or for Moses, for Aaron, even for King David. Surely you remember a time in King David's life where he was on a roll. It started with gazing at a woman that wasn't his wife, and it ended in breaking of almost every commandment that had been given. Life seemed to be going nothing but downhill for him for quite a while. But part of the commandments that he kept allowed him to turn again and be the man that had the heart for God. There's one more thing that seems to come with today's Hebrew Testament gospel text. It's renaming. Abram to Abraham. Sarai to Sarah. Simon to Peter. Maybe in my own case, dean to disciple. How about you? What's your new name in baptism? In our tradition, we don't often rename literally in quite that same way, but what's the name you took on in your baptism? Was it disciple? Christian? Lay minister? Follower? Leader? The question that we, of course, have to ask, though, is how will we go before God? How will our lives reflect the powerful testimony of our faith? What will others come to know of God because of our faith and our walk with Jesus? When we're asked to follow through difficult circumstances, how will we go? How will we proceed? How will we represent that for which we live and breathe and in which we have our entire being? Testimony certainly is a powerful way for us to hear and to experience this life in which we're called to walk before God. We've talked from time to time about an elevator speech. If you had 2 or 3 minutes to talk about your faith, what would you say? That opportunity can come at any time along that path, along that journey. Are you ready? What are our success stories? What are our stories about how God was with us even in our failures? Even when we've fallen down? Because those stories matter every bit as much. And what about our stories of accepting the grace to turn and begin again? Because we all fall. Whether disciples or not, all of us are in that big realm of those who are susceptible to failing, to letting others in our lives down. But we aren't asked to be a hero. Neither was Abraham. But a human living under God's covenant. Biblical heroes are so entirely different than our pop culture heroes and icons. So let's be real with ourselves and with one another, so that we can walk before God and be blameless, so that our faith too can be counted as righteousness. Amen.